The first thing I remember about that winter is the sound of a door closing, not slamming, not the dramatic kind of ending you see in movies where glass shatters and someone screams into the rain. Just a click. Soft. Final. The kind of sound that tells you a person has already made up their mind long before they say goodbye out loud. I was 7 months pregnant when I heard it. My name is Travis Galvin, and if you had told me a year before that moment that I would be standing barefoot on cold tile, one hand braced against the counter and the other pressed to the curve of my stomach, watching the only person I had built a life with walk out with 2 suitcases and not look back, I would have laughed. I would have said that kind of thing happened to other people. Weaker people. People who didn't choose carefully. I had chosen carefully. Or so I believed. His name doesn't matter anymore. I spent months making it matter, turning it over in my mouth like a stone I couldn't stop touching, but it doesn't matter now, so I won't give him the dignity of being remembered by name in this story. He was an alpha, and for 2 years I thought he was mine, and when the pregnancy test turned positive, he smiled the kind of smile that made me believe in permanence. 4 months later, when the doctor said 1 heartbeat instead of the 2 he'd been hoping for, something in his face closed like a shop at the end of a long day. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me of anything. He simply began, slowly, methodically, to leave. By the time he actually walked out, it wasn't a shock. It was just the last domino falling in a line he'd set up months before. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after the door clicked shut, long enough that my knees started to ache from locking them straight. Long enough that the baby, my baby, shifted low and hard, a foot or an elbow pressing against my ribs like they too were asking what happens now. I didn't have an answer. Not that night, and not for a long time after. Before I go further, I should tell you what the 2 years before that door clicked shut actually looked like, because grief only makes sense once you understand what it cost to lose. I met him at 24, at a mutual friend's housewarming party, back when I still believed the world handed out soulmates as generously as it handed out bad weather. He was charming in the way that confident alphas often are, quick with a compliment, quicker with a hand at the small of your back that felt protective instead of presumptuous. I fell for him slowly and then all at once, the way you fall asleep on a long drive, unaware of the exact moment consciousness slips away until you're already gone. For the first year, it was good. I want to be fair to that version of him because pretending the whole relationship was rotten from the start would be its own kind of lie. And I promised myself when I started telling this story that I wouldn't lie, not even about the parts that are hard to look at directly. He remembered how I took my coffee. He drove 40 minutes out of his way once just to bring me soup when I had the flu. He told me, on our first anniversary, that he'd never imagined wanting permanence with anyone until he met me. I believed him completely. That's the part that still stings, even now, even with everything that came after. Not that he lied exactly, but that I trusted the shape of what he said, instead of paying attention to the way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, every time one of his coworkers mentioned their own children. I didn't notice, or I noticed and decided it didn't mean anything, because noticing would have meant admitting that the foundation I was building my future on had a crack running straight through it. When I told him I was pregnant, he smiled first. I remember that smile clearly, because it was the last uncomplicated happiness I saw on his face for the rest of our relationship. He hugged me so tightly, I laughed and told him to be careful. And for exactly one evening, we were the kind of happy that doesn't need words to prove itself. The unraveling started small. A distracted quality to his attention. Longer hours at work that didn't quite add up against his usual schedule. A new habit of stepping out onto the balcony to take phone calls he wouldn't explain afterward. I told myself it was stress. New fatherhood does that to people, I reasoned. It would pass once the shock wore off, and the reality of a baby became something solid enough to hold on to instead of something abstract and frightening. It didn't pass. If anything, it deepened the distance between us, widening a little more every week until by the 4th month. When the ultrasound technician told us gently that there was only 1 heartbeat, instead of the 2 he had apparently been quietly hoping for something, in him simply gave up trying to hide the retreat any longer. He never said it outright. That would have required a kind of honesty he didn't have in him, at least not toward me. Instead, he grew quieter, colder. He started sleeping on the couch some nights, claiming my restlessness kept him awake, though I slept like the dead most evenings, exhausted in the particular bone-deep way pregnancy demands. He stopped touching my stomach the way he had in those first hopeful weeks, hands that used to rest there instinctively now finding excuses to be elsewhere. I confronted him twice. Both times he told me I was imagining things that pregnancy hormones were making me paranoid, and both times I believed him, because believing the alternative would have meant admitting I had built 2 years of my life on ground that had never been as solid as I thought. The third time I didn't confront him. I simply woke up one morning in my 7th month to find him packing, methodical and calm, like a man closing out a lease rather than ending a relationship. I asked him why. He told me without any real anger in his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had yelled, that he had realized he wasn't built for this kind of life. That he tried to want it and couldn't quite manage it, and that he thought it was kinder to leave now than to keep pretending until the baby arrived and made the pretending impossible. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the years since. Kinder to leave now. As though there was some version of kindness contained inside abandoning a pregnant partner 3 weeks before a doctor's appointment where I would need someone in the waiting room with me. As though timing could soften the fundamental cruelty of the act itself. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. Some numb, self-protective part of me simply watched him zip the second suitcase, watched him hesitate for exactly 1 second at the door as though some remnant of decency was asking him to reconsider, and then watched him decide against it anyway. The click of that door has stayed with me for years, not because it was loud, because it was so quiet, so careful, like even in leaving, he wanted to minimize the disruption he was causing, as though the softness of the sound could make up for the size of what he was taking with him. People tell you that omegas are built for this. Built to endure, built to nurture even when everything around them is collapsing. I used to resent that phrase. It always sounded like an excuse someone made up so they could feel better about walking away from us. But there was a strange kind of truth buried in it too, because somehow, even after the door clicked shut, even after the apartment felt too big and too quiet, I got up the next morning. I made tea. I didn't drink. I went to my part-time job, answering phones for a shipping company because rent doesn't care about heartbreak, and I kept going the way water keeps moving downhill without deciding to. Just because there was nowhere else for it to go. I won't pretend those months were noble. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub, hands splayed over my stomach, whispering apologies to a person who hadn't even been born yet. Apologizing for the father he wouldn't have. Apologizing for the fact that his mother, because that's what I was to him, even carrying him inside me, could not stop crying long enough to feel like someone worth being brought into the world by. But somewhere around month 8, something shifted. I remembered the exact night. I was lying on my side, unable to get comfortable in any position, and my son, because somehow I already knew he was a son, long before any doctor confirmed it. Kicked so hard, I gasped out loud into the dark, and instead of crying, I laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of me, and I said out loud to an empty room, okay, you and me, that's the deal now. That was the moment I stopped waiting for someone to come back and started building a life that didn't need him to. He was born on a Thursday in early spring, 3 weeks earlier than expected, in a hospital room where the only hand I had to hold was my own fist pressed against the rail of the bed. I named him Elias. It means, "The Lord is my God," which felt like an odd thing for someone who had spent the last 2 months furious at every version of fate and fortune he could name. But it also meant something else to me. It meant I believed something good could still come from all of this. That naming him something that carried hope wasn't naive. It was defiant. He had dark hair, unusual for a newborn, and eyes that would not settle on a color for weeks. He cried the healthy, furious cry of a baby who has decided immediately that he intends to be heard. I remember holding him against my chest, skin to skin, shaking with exhaustion, and something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere tangled between the two. And thinking, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I am going to do it. What I did not know could not have known, standing in that fluorescent lit room with a nurse humming under her breath as she cleaned instruments nearby, was that somewhere across the city, a man named Richard Watkins was closing down his family's construction firm for the night, checking messages on his phone, entirely unaware that his life had already begun bending toward mine. That the universe, or fate, or whatever cruel and patient thing arranges these matters, had already started drawing a line between his front door and my hospital bed. It would take another 8 months for that line to become visible, but it had already been drawn. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think the version of this story people expect is one where the struggling single Omega parent suffers nobly and silently until rescue arrives. That is not what happened. What happened was harder and messier and, in its own way, more human. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being poor and postpartum at the same time, and I don't think anyone can understand it fully unless they've lived inside it. It isn't just the tiredness of a body recovering from birth, or the sleeplessness of caring for a newborn who hasn't yet learned the difference between day and night. It's the constant, low-grade arithmetic running in the back of your mind every waking hour. If I buy formula this week, can the electric bill wait another 5 days? If I skip my own lunch, does that stretch far enough to cover the copay for his next checkup? I got very good in those months at making myself smaller in every way that didn't involve my son. Smaller portions, smaller comforts, a smaller and smaller version of myself folding down like origami around the one thing I refused to let shrink, which was his care. I lost my job 3 months after Elias was born. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because the shipping company downsized, and the newest hire with the most obvious need for flexible hours was, unsurprisingly, the first one let go. I applied everywhere. I took work answering surveys over the phone for a wage that barely covered formula. My savings, modest to begin with, thinned and then disappeared. My landlord, a decent enough man named Oscar, who had 2 kids of his own, gave me 2 extra months of grace before he had to tell me apologetically that he couldn't carry me any further without risking his own mortgage. I remember the night I made the decision that would eventually change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. I sat at my kitchen table. Elias asleep in the carrier beside me, a stack of bills in front of me that no amount of rearranging would make smaller. And I called the only person I had left who might be able to help without judgment. My cousin, Marisol, who worked as a case coordinator for a private foster and kinship placement agency. I didn't ask her to take Elias. I want that understood clearly, because for a long time afterward, in my worst moments, I convinced myself that was exactly what I'd done, that I had given up. What I actually asked her was whether there was a program, something temporary, something that could bridge the gap while I got back on my feet, so that my son would have stability while I clawed my way out of the hole I'd fallen into. She told me about a short-term kinship and emergency placement program. Licensed caregivers, background checked, monitored by the agency, meant for exactly situations like mine. Not adoption, not permanent, a bridge. I signed the paperwork with my hand shaking so badly the notary had to steady it for me. The caregiver's name on the paperwork was Richard Watkins. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. The day I met him, I almost didn't go through with it. I remember standing outside a well-kept 2-story house with pale brick and a wraparound porch, Elias's diaper bag slung over one shoulder and his carrier gripped so tightly in my other hand that my knuckles had gone white. Marisol stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my back, murmuring something reassuring I couldn't quite hear over the pounding in my own ears. The door opened before we even knocked, and there he was. Richard Watkins was tall in the specific way that made a doorway look smaller than it was. Broad through the shoulders, dark hair cropped close, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. But it wasn't his size that stopped the breath in my throat. It was the scent that reached me before he'd said a single word. A scent that hit something ancient and unguarded in the back of my mind. Something that had nothing to do with logic or timing or how thoroughly unprepared I was for it. Cedar. Rain on warm stone. Something underneath that I couldn't name, but that made my knees feel unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the 4 flights of stairs I'd just climbed. I had never, not once, in 26 years of life, had a reaction like that to another person's scent. I had read about it. Mates, true mates, the kind of bond that made your entire biology sit up and take notice. I had always assumed it was exaggerated, romanticized, a story parents told children to make courtship feel more magical than it actually was. Standing on that porch with my son asleep against my chest, I understood for the first time that it was real, and that it was the single worst possible moment for it to happen to me. Richard's expression flickered, just for a second, something crossing his features too fast for me to name it, before it smoothed back into polite, careful neutrality. "You must be Travis," he said, extending a hand that I stared at for a beat too long before I managed to take it. His grip was warm and careful, like he was worried about breaking something. "This is Elias," I managed, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. Richard looked down at the carrier, and something in his face changed again, softer this time, unguarded in a way that made my chest ache with an emotion I didn't have a name for yet. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, so quiet it was almost not meant for me to hear at all. I don't know what I expected from that first meeting. Coldness, maybe. Professional distance. What I got instead was a man who knelt right there on his own porch in front of a stranger and a case coordinator and let my son's tiny fist wrap around one of his fingers. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I left an hour later without my son, and I cried the entire drive home. Not because I regretted the decision, because some deep wordless part of me already knew that I had just handed the most important thing in my life to a man my body had recognized as mine. And I had no idea what that was supposed to mean or what I was supposed to do about it. The agreement was for 90 days, renewable if necessary, with weekly supervised visits and monthly reviews. I want to be clear that Richard Watkins did not adopt my son the week we met. That is not how any of this works, and I won't pretend it happened faster than it did, because the slowness of it, the aching, deliberate slowness, is part of what makes this story mine. For the first few weeks, I saw Elias every Sunday afternoon in a supervised visitation room at Marisol's agency that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. Richard would drop him off 10 minutes early every single time, hand him over with a diaper bag meticulously organized, extra outfit included, a small typed note with any updates from the week. Feeding schedule. New sounds he'd started making. The one afternoon he'd apparently refused to nap until Richard sang to him, off-key and embarrassed, some song about a train. I looked forward to those notes more than I probably should have. By the 6th week, Marisol suggested, given how well things were going and how much stability Elias seemed to be gaining, that unsupervised visits might be appropriate. That meant, for the first time since I'd signed those papers, that I would see Richard Watkins outside the fluorescent lighting of an agency office. He suggested a park near his house. Neutral ground, he called it, careful in that particular way he had, like he was trying very hard not to make me feel like I was walking into his territory. I remember sitting on a bench in early autumn light, watching him push Elias in a baby swing so gently it barely moved, laughing under his breath every time my son made a delighted gummy noise. And thinking that I had never in my life seen a man so at ease with something so small and so breakable. "You're good with him," I said, the words slipping out before I could measure them. Richard glanced over at me, and for a moment something vulnerable moved behind his eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "He makes it easy," he said. "Some kids do that, make you want to be good at this." I didn't tell him, that day, about the scent. About the way my body had reacted the first time I stood on his porch, the way it still reacted every single time he got close enough for me to catch it again. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that whatever biological alarm bell had gone off in me was irrelevant to the situation at hand, which was my son's safety and stability, not my own tangled, inconvenient feelings. I was very good, in those early months, at lying to myself. The reviews from the agency kept coming back positive. Elias was thriving, gaining weight steadily, meeting every developmental marker early instead of late. Richard's home study, which I read in its entirety because Marisol let me, described a man with no criminal history, stable income from a family construction business he'd taken over from his father, a support system of 2 sisters who lived nearby and adored being aunts to any child who crossed their threshold. It described a man who had, according to his own intake interview, always wanted children and had simply never found the right partner or the right timing. I remember reading that line, always wanted children, and having to set the folder down for a full minute before I could keep reading. 90 days became 180. My own life had begun, slowly and unglamorously, to stabilize. I found steady work doing intake coordination for a medical clinic. Work that used the organizational instincts I'd developed, answering phones for years. I found a smaller but stable apartment. I started saving, carefully, obsessively, the way a person saves when they have learned the hard way exactly how fast a floor can disappear beneath them. But every review meeting, every extension, Marisol would ask me the same gentle question. Was I ready to bring Elias home full-time? And every time, something in my chest would twist with a complicated, ashamed relief when I said, not yet. A few more weeks. I told myself it was about stability. About making sure the ground beneath us both was solid enough to hold. I told myself it had nothing to do with the fact that leaving Elias with Richard meant I got to keep seeing Richard, week after week, in a way that had slowly, quietly, become the best part of my life. Somewhere in that stretch of unsupervised visits, I met Richard's sisters, and I think that afternoon deserves its own place in this story because it was the first time I understood the family I might be walking into. Not just the man. Their names were Denise and Priya, both older than Richard, both loud in the specific, affectionate way of people who have never once doubted their welcome in a room. I arrived at Richard's house for a scheduled visit to find both of them already there, cooing over Elias in his bouncer, arguing cheerfully over whether he had Richard's nose or, as Priya insisted, their late mother's. "You must be Travis," Denise said, standing to hug me before I'd even set down the diaper bag, the gesture so immediate and unguarded that I stiffened out of pure surprise before relaxing into it. "Richard's told us basically nothing about you, which for him is basically a 5-alarm fire of a tell." "Denise," Richard said, in the long-suffering tone of a younger sibling who had clearly had decades of practice being embarrassed by this exact woman. "I'm just saying," Denise continued, entirely unbothered. "Our brother does not go quiet about things he doesn't care about. He goes quiet about the things that matter too much to talk about casually. So you must matter a great deal, is what I'm saying." I didn't know what to do with that information, delivered so casually over a diaper bag and a baby who had at that exact moment decided to blow an enormous, delighted raspberry that made all 4 adults in the room burst out laughing at once. Priya was quieter than her sister, but no less warm, and at one point, while Richard and Denise argued in the kitchen over whose turn it was to bring the good wine to the next family dinner, she sat beside me on the couch and asked gently how I was holding up. "Truthfully," I said, "some days I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, leaving him here, even though I know he's safe, even though I know Richard's good for him." Priya was quiet for a moment, watching her brother across the room making an utter fool of himself trying to get Elias to laugh again. "You know," she said, "I've watched Richard date exactly 3 people in the last decade, and none of them made it past 6 months because none of them ever felt like the missing piece he kept looking for. I've never once seen him look at anyone or anything the way he looks at that baby, or the way he looks at you when he thinks nobody's paying attention." I didn't have a response for that. I just watched Richard scoop Elias up into the air, slow and careful, my son shrieking with the particular joy only babies have for being lifted toward the ceiling, and felt something in my chest crack open just slightly wider than it had been the day before. The turning point, the one I still think about more than any other single day in this whole story, happened in early winter, almost a year after that first door had clicked shut behind me. Elias had a fever. Not a dangerous one, the pediatrician assured us both over the phone. Just the ordinary misery of a body fighting off a cold, but high enough that neither Richard nor I could pretend to be calm about it. I drove to his house at 11 at night without calling first. Something I had never done, some instinct older than manners pulling me out of my own bed and into my car. Richard opened the door before I even reached the porch steps, Elias against his shoulder, both of them looking exhausted in a way that made my heart clench painfully. "He won't settle," Richard said, voice rough with worry and lack of sleep. "I've tried everything. I didn't want to call you this late. I know it's not." "You should have called the second it started," I said already, reaching for my son. And the moment Elias's small hot body settled against my chest, he let out a shuddering breath and went. For the first time in hours, apparently quiet. We sat together on Richard's couch until nearly 4 in the morning, passing Elias back and forth, taking turns pacing him through the worst of the fever chills, and somewhere around 3 exhausted past the point of guarding myself properly. I fell asleep, sitting up my head, tipping sideways, until it came to rest against Richard's shoulder. I woke to the smell of him surrounding me, warm and close his arm, having somehow settled around my back at some point to keep me from sliding off the cushion entirely. Elias asleep between us with one small hand fisted in the fabric of Richard's shirt. Neither of us moved for a long moment. I don't know if he was awake the whole time, or woke up the same instant I did. But when I finally lifted my head and looked at him, his eyes were already on me, dark and quiet and asking a question neither of us was ready to say out loud yet. "I should go home," I whispered. "You should stay until it's light out at least," he said, just as quiet. "It's not safe, driving this tired." I stayed, not because of what my body wanted, though it wanted, badly, to stay pressed against his side until the sun came up. I stayed because some part of me, the part that had spent a year rebuilding itself plank by careful plank, had started to understand that the safest place I had found in longer than I could remember was sitting exactly where I already was. I need to explain something about mates, because I think people who haven't experienced it imagine it as something instant and overwhelming, a lightning bolt that leaves no room for doubt. That isn't entirely true. What it actually is, at least what it was for me, is something quieter and more insidious. A gravity you don't notice building until you try to walk away and find you can't quite manage it. A scent that becomes less like a stranger's and more like something your body has already decided is home, long before your mind catches up and agrees. I had known, on some animal level, from the very first afternoon on that porch, that Richard Watkins was mine in the old biological sense of the word. What I hadn't let myself know, hadn't let myself even consider, was whether that recognition went both ways. I found out on a Sunday in late winter, nearly 14 months after Elias was born, in the kitchen of the house I had, by then, started to think of as a second home. I was helping Richard put away groceries, Elias babbling contentedly in his high chair nearby, gnawing on a teething ring with the fierce concentration only an 8-month-old can bring to something so simple. Richard reached past me for a cabinet at the same moment I reached for the same shelf, and our hands brushed and something electric and unmistakable passed between us. The kind of contact neither of us could pretend was accidental after the fact. He went very still. I went very still. And for a moment, we simply stood there close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that his scent cedar rain on stone, that something underneath I still couldn't name, wrapped around me so completely I forgot briefly how to breathe properly. "Travis," he said, low, careful, like my name was something he'd been holding in his mouth for months, afraid of what would happen if he finally let it out. "Can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer if it's out of line?" I nodded, throat too tight to manage words. "Have you felt it too? Since the beginning? Whatever this is." I could have lied. I had spent over a year lying to myself about exactly this question, telling myself it was inappropriate, complicated, a betrayal of the careful boundaries that were supposed to keep my son safe and my heart intact. But standing there, close enough to feel his breath, I found I didn't have any lies left in me. "Since the first time you opened that door," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I was imagining it, or that it didn't matter because of everything else going on." Something in his face broke open then, relief and disbelief and a kind of raw, unguarded hope I had never seen on him before, not even in all the months of watching him be gentle and careful with my son. "I thought I was losing my mind," he said. "Every single visit, every time you walked through that door, I had to remind myself you weren't mine to want, that you had every reason in the world not to want an alpha again after everything." "Not every alpha," I said. "Just the one who left." He reached up slow enough that I could have stopped him and brushed his knuckles along my jaw, and I leaned into the touch before I could think better of it, before either of us could remember all the reasons this was complicated. "I need you to know," he said, "that whatever happens between us, whatever this is, it doesn't change anything about him. I would keep loving that boy exactly the same, whether you and I figure this out or whether we don't. I need you to know that first, before anything else." I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other thing anyone has ever said to me, because it would have been so easy, so understandable even, for him to make our connection about convenience, about how neatly it would tie together the family he already loved. Instead, he made sure, before anything else was said or done, that I understood my son's place in his heart wasn't contingent on mine. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of what I felt for him. I wish I could tell you that everything after that kitchen conversation moved smoothly, that recognizing each other as mates dissolved every remaining obstacle in an instant. It didn't. There were hard conversations still ahead of us, practical ones, about what it would mean to blend a life that had been carefully, deliberately kept in separate rooms for over a year. The agency review came up 2 weeks later, and I remember sitting across from Marisol's desk, Richard beside me for the first time in an official capacity rather than as the caregiver on the other side of a case file, and telling her the truth, that we had recognized each other, that we wanted, if it was possible within the bounds of the program, to move toward something permanent, together, for Elias and for ourselves. Marisol, to her credit, did not look remotely surprised. "I've done this job 12 years, she said, closing the folder in front of her with something like a smile. "You'd be amazed how often the universe already knows what it's doing before any of us catch up to the paperwork." The formal adoption paperwork Richard had filed months earlier, back when we both still believed our arrangement was purely practical, a caregiver providing stability while a struggling parent found his footing, was amended. Not to remove me, never that. I want to be clear that I never once considered giving up my son permanently to anyone, mate or not. It was amended to reflect what we both wanted moving forward: a shared home, a shared name on the paperwork, 2 parents instead of 1 caregiver, and 1 visiting mother clinging to Sundays in a park. We moved in together on a warm morning in early spring, almost exactly 2 years after that first door had clicked shut behind a man who no longer mattered to my story at all. I remember standing in the doorway of what would become our bedroom boxes stacked around me, Elias toddling unsteadily between rooms exploring his new home with the fearless curiosity only a child who has never known instability can have. And Richard coming up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin against the top of my head. "Welcome home," he murmured against my hair. "It already feels like it was always going to be home," I said, "like we just took the long way getting here." I don't want to give the impression that everything between moving in together and the eventual bonding was easy, because it wasn't. And I think leaving that part out would make the whole thing feel too much like a fairy tale instead of the real, complicated love it actually was. About 4 months after we moved in together, we had our first real fight, and it happened, of all things, over something as small as a missed phone call. Richard had gone to pick up materials for a job site nearly 2 hours away and hadn't checked in by the time evening came, hadn't answered 3 texts and 2 calls. And by the time he finally walked through the door cheerful and oblivious, explaining he'd simply lost signal out past the county line. I had already worked myself into a state I wasn't proud of. "You can't just disappear like that," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be, Elias watching us both from his high chair with the wide, uncertain eyes children get when they sense tension they don't have words for yet. "Not to me, not after everything." Richard set down his keys slowly, and I watched understanding move across his face, not defensiveness, which was somehow worse in the moment because it left me nothing to push against. "This isn't really about the phone call, is it?" he said quietly. "No," I admitted, and felt my anger crumble into something much rawer and harder to say out loud. "It's about the last time someone I loved decided, without telling me, that leaving was easier than staying. I know it's not fair to put that on you. I know you didn't do anything wrong today. But some part of me is always waiting for the door to click shut again, and I hate that. I hate that he's still in my head after everything, but he is." Richard crossed the kitchen slowly, giving me every chance to step back if I needed to, and when I didn't, he wrapped his arms around me, careful and solid. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, low and steady against my hair. "Not because I feel obligated to prove something. Because there's nowhere else I want to be. I know I can't undo what he did to you. But I can keep showing up every single day, for as long as it takes for your body to believe it the way your heart already does." I cried harder that night than I had in months, not out of sadness exactly, but out of the strange, disorienting relief of finally being held by someone who didn't flinch away from the mess of my fear. We talked until nearly midnight about the specific shape of what abandonment had carved into me, about the small habits I hadn't even noticed. I'd developed flinching at slammed cabinet doors, needing to know his schedule further in advance than was probably reasonable. And Richard listened to all of it without once making me feel like a burden for needing reassurance. It wasn't the last hard conversation we had. There were other nights, other small conflicts. The ordinary friction of two people building a life together instead of simply falling into one. But that fight taught me something important, which is that the difference between the man who left and the man I was building a home with wasn't that Richard never made mistakes. It was that he never once used my fear as a reason to stop trying. I want to tell you about the bonding because I think it matters, the difference between choosing someone and being biologically pulled toward them. We waited. Neither of us rushed toward the mating bite the way some pairs do the moment recognition happens because we both understood without needing to say it aloud. That trust had to be built brick by brick before either of us handed over something as permanent as a mark. It happened nearly 8 months after we moved in together, on a night that had nothing dramatic about it at all, which I think is exactly why I remember it so clearly. Elias was asleep down the hall, worn out from a day at the park with his aunts, and Richard and I were lying together in the dark, my back against his chest. His arm slung heavy and warm across my waist, and I felt more than heard him press his lips against the curve of my shoulder. "I want to ask you something," he said, voice low and rough, with something that sounded almost like nervousness, which struck me as strange coming from a man who had never once, in all the months I'd known him, seemed unsure of anything involving me or my son. "And I need you to know, you can say no. I need you to know it won't change anything about how I feel, or what we're building here." I turned in his arms so I could see his face in the low light. "Ask me." "I want to mark you," he said, "properly, permanently. Not because it would make things official on paper, we've already done that part. Because I don't want to spend one more day of my life without knowing that you're mine, the way my body has known it since the first afternoon you walked up my porch steps." I didn't answer with words. I tilted my head, baring the line of my throat to him. An old gesture older than either of us, older than the paperwork and the case files and every careful, deliberate step we'd taken to get to this exact point, and I felt him go still with something like reverence before his mouth found the place where my neck met my shoulder. The bite when it came hurt for exactly 1 second before something else took over entirely, a warmth that spread through my whole body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A sense of rightness, so total, it nearly brought me to tears. I felt him shudder against me, felt the moment his own instincts settled into something calmer, steadier, the restless searching quality that had lived under his skin since the day we met, finally quieting. Mine, he breathed against my throat, voice wrecked and reverent all at once. Yours, I agreed, and meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything in my life. People ask me sometimes, mostly people who don't know the whole story, whether I resent the man who left, whether I lie awake angry at the version of events that led me to that hospital room alone, to those months of struggling, to the decision that eventually put my son into another man's arms before I understood what that man would come to mean to both of us. I don't. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important, and because I think a lot of stories like mine end with some triumphant declaration of hatred toward whoever caused the original pain, as though bitterness is the only appropriate response to heartbreak. But if he hadn't left, I would never have needed the agency's program. I would never have stood on that porch and caught the scent of cedar and rain that told my whole biology it had finally found what it had been looking for. Elias would never have grown up in a house with two parents who chose each other, deliberately, slowly, brick by careful brick, instead of simply falling into each other out of convenience or habit. I don't thank him. He doesn't deserve gratitude for abandoning a pregnant partner in a kitchen with a door that clicked shut too softly to feel like the ending it actually was. But I have made peace with the shape of the path he forced me onto, because it led, eventually, impossibly, to exactly where I was always supposed to end up. We got the dog, for the record, a scruffy, good-natured mutt, Elias named Biscuit, over both our mild objections, who now sleeps at the foot of our bed most nights, and has appointed himself the unofficial guardian of every garden bed in the backyard. Elias is 4 now. He calls Richard Dad and me Papa, a distinction he came up with entirely on his own at around age 2 and has never once wavered from since. He has Richard's stubborn jaw and my quick temper, a combination his aunts find endlessly entertaining and occasionally exhausting. He does not remember, of course, the months of instability before Richard's front door, the fever that nearly broke both our hearts on that long night on the couch. The agency paperwork and the supervised visits and every careful step two frightened adults took toward the life we eventually built together. To him, there has only ever been one house, one family, two parents who love him and each other in equal, steady measure. Sometimes late at night, after Elias has been tucked in and the house has gone quiet around us, I find myself standing in the doorway of his room watching him sleep, and Richard finds me there. Wraps his arms around me from behind the way he has 1,000 times by now, and presses a kiss to the mark on my throat that has long since healed into something soft and permanent. Still can't believe how close we came to never finding each other, he murmurs sometimes, voice rough with the particular tenderness that only comes out in these quiet hours. We were always going to find each other, I tell him, every time, because I believe it more completely now than I have believed almost anything else in my life. It just took the both of us a while to catch up to what our bodies already knew. The proposal came almost a year after the bonding, though in truth we had already been living, as good as married for most of that time, sharing a bed, a mortgage, a son, a rhythm of mornings and evenings that had settled into something so steady it barely needed a name. But Richard, it turned out, was the kind of man who believed some things deserved ceremony even when the substance had long since been decided. He asked me on a Saturday morning in early summer, in the backyard of the house we shared, no elaborate setup, no hidden photographer, no audience of family pretending not to watch from a window. Just the two of us and Elias, who was nearly 3 by then, and had recently discovered an intense passion for helping with anything involving dirt. I want to tell you something, Richard said, kneeling down not in front of me first, but in front of Elias, who looked up from the small garden bed he'd been enthusiastically overwatering. I'm going to ask your papa an important question, and I want your permission first, because you were here before I was, and your opinion matters most of all. Elias, with all the grave seriousness a not quite 3-year-old can muster, considered this for a long moment before declaring, "Okay, but he has to say yes so we can get a dog." Richard laughed, startled and delighted, and I found myself laughing too hard enough that when he finally turned to me, ring held in a slightly dirt-smudged hand because he'd apparently been unable to resist helping with the garden bed first, I was still wiping tears of laughter, not yet nerves, from my eyes. "Travis Galvin," he said, and something in his voice shifted from playful to unbearably sincere in the space of my name. "I have loved you since before I understood what loving you would mean. I loved you as the parent of a child I was lucky enough to help raise. I loved you as my mate the moment my body finally admitted what it had known since the day you walked up my porch steps. And I love you now as the person I want beside me for every ordinary morning I have left, not because fate decided it for us, though I'm grateful every day that it did, but because I choose you deliberately, with my whole clear mind every single day since. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he'd even fully finished lifting the ring, which made him laugh again, breathless and relieved. And Elias, apparently satisfied that the important business had been concluded satisfactorily, returned immediately to his garden bed, informing us both cheerfully that we could hug later because the flowers needed water right now. We married that autumn, a small gathering in Denise's backyard, string lights and folding chairs, and Priya crying before either of us had said a single vow. My cousin Marisol stood up during the reception, glass raised, and told the assembled guests that in 12 years of casework she had filed exactly one home study that turned halfway through the process into a wedding invitation, and that she intended to frame the paperwork alongside the photograph from that day, because some stories deserve to be kept in more than one form. Elias, dressed in a small suit he found intensely uncomfortable and complained about extensively, stood between us during the ceremony, one small hand in each of ours. And when the officiant asked if there was anything either of us wanted to add before the vows, Richard knelt down one more time and asked Elias if he wanted to say anything too. "I love you both a whole lot," Elias announced to the assembled guests, with the same grave seriousness he brought to garden beds and important family decisions. "And we're getting a dog." The laughter that followed carried us both through the rest of the ceremony, and I remember thinking, standing there with my son's hand in mine and my husband's steady gaze holding mine like a promise, that grief and joy really can occupy the same life without canceling each other out. That the door which clicked shut so many years before hadn't ended my story after all. It had simply been the door I needed to walk through to find this one. There is one more conversation I want to include here, one that happened long after the bonding, nearly a year into our marriage, because I think it answers a question I know some people reading this story are still asking themselves. Did Richard feel it the way I did from the very beginning, or did his side of things grow more slowly, built on choice rather than instinct? We were sitting on the back porch one evening, Elias asleep inside, a bottle of wine between us that neither of us was drinking very seriously, and I finally asked him outright. "That first day," I said, "on the porch, did you feel it too, or did that come later for you?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly in the porch light. "I felt something," he admitted. "I want to be honest with you, because you've always been honest with me, even when it was hard. What I felt that first day wasn't as clear as what you're describing. It was more like walking into a room and immediately knowing the furniture had been rearranged, even if you can't say exactly what's different. Something in me sat up and paid attention the second I opened that door. I told myself it was nerves. New caregiver, new case, wanting to make a good impression on a parent going through something difficult. When did it stop being nerves?" I asked. "The night Elias had the fever," he said, without hesitation, which told me he had thought about this exact question long before I asked it. "Watching you fall asleep against my shoulder, watching how naturally you fit there, like your body had already decided something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I laid awake most of that night, after you finally drifted off for real, just thinking about how wrong it felt every single Sunday when you had to leave. Not wrong like a policy violation. Wrong like watching someone walk out of a room that was supposed to be theirs. So you knew before I said anything in the kitchen." "I knew," he said, And I was terrified of it because you'd just survived someone deciding you weren't worth staying for. I didn't want to be another alpha adding pressure to a life you were still rebuilding. I told myself I'd wait as long as it took, even if that meant years, even if that meant never saying anything at all if you didn't feel the same. I reached over and took his hand, lacing our fingers together the way I'd done 1,000 times since that kitchen conversation, and felt, as I always did, that same low, settled warmth spreading through my chest. "I'm glad neither of us had to wait years," I said. "Me too," he said, bringing my hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss against my knuckles. Though for what it's worth, I would have, however long it took. I'd already decided that boy in there was worth loving unconditionally, and somewhere along the way, without really noticing the exact moment it happened, I decided the same thing about his father. He laughs quiet and warm and pulls me back against his chest, and we stand there together in the dark hallway outside our son's room. Two people who started as a case file and a struggling stranger and became, somewhere, in the slow accumulation of Sundays and fevers and careful conversations, exactly what neither of us knew we were looking for. The door that clicked shut behind me on that first cold morning felt, at the time, like the end of everything I thought I understood about my life. I know now it was only ever the beginning. The first quiet turn in a much longer road. One that led eventually through heartbreak and struggle and fear straight to the porch of a man named Richard Watkins, who opened his door, and without either of us realizing it, yet opened the rest of our lives along with it. And if you ask me now whether I would change a single step of that long, hard road, even the parts that ached the most, even the nights I cried on bathroom floors, and the mornings I signed paperwork with a shaking hand, I would tell you no. Because every one of those steps, however painful, was carrying me toward him the entire time. Toward the porch. Toward the scent of cedar and rain that told me, long before I understood it, that I had already found home. Sometimes I think about the version of me who stood in that kitchen listening to a door click shut, certain that his life had just been broken beyond repair. I wish I could reach back through the years and tell him what was waiting on the other side of all that grief. Not to erase the pain, because the pain was real and it deserved to be felt fully, not rushed past in service of a happier ending. But I would tell him to hold on. I would tell him that the same body capable of carrying so much sorrow was also capable of recognizing, instantly and completely, the person it had been waiting for all along. I would tell him that struggling alone for a season doesn't mean struggling alone forever. And that sometimes the very lowest point of a story is simply the ground giving way to make room for something sturdier to be built in its place. Richard tells me, on the nights when old fears creep back and uninvited, that scars are just proof, a wound learned how to close. I used to think that was the kind of thing people said to make hardship sound meaningful in hindsight, a way of dressing up suffering so it feels less senseless. I don't think that anymore. I think some wounds really do close into something stronger than the skin around them, and I think mine did, slowly, patiently, under the steady care of a man who never once asked me to hurry the healing along. We are all three of us, and now four, counting Biscuit, snoring at the foot of the bed. An ordinary family living an ordinary life, full of missed alarms and burnt dinners and arguments over whose turn it is to do the dishes. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of our days runs something I never take for granted, not for a single morning. The quiet, settled certainty of having found exactly where I belong, carried there not by fate alone, but by every hard, deliberate step I took to survive long enough to reach it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.